Howdy, everyone. This is Jeff Mago again with the Lease and Build podcast, tenantimprovement.com. For those of you who are new to the podcast, tenantimprovement.com is a industry platform. If you are a business owner, business manager, if you're a leasing broker, a property manager, and you're about to embark on some type of capital improvement or tenant improvement construction project, the website, the podcast aims to be a resource for you. And so there's about 40 different trade categories in and around the tenant improvement world. And we look to just interview experts to give you guys insights into that process if you don't do it on a regular basis. My name is Jeff Mago. I also own a commercial floor covering dealer in Houston, Texas. So we can do just about any kind of flooring you want, whether you walk on it or roll on it, we can handle it for you. So today I am joined by a good friend of mine, Charlie Neuhaus with Partners in Real Estate. He is a commercial leasing broker. So we were just joking about we've been trying to plan this one. I'm excited to get it on the books and start it because at the beginning of the process of a tenant improvement project, there's a lease and the lease needs to be signed. And Charlie's actually worked and helped Floor Zone on several leases over the years. And in the beginning, I'm like going, well, what does Charlie do? And then I'll mention some of this in the middle where it's been very helpful to have you on our side so that people can actually learn. And so, anyways, Charlie, it's
glad to be here. This is great.
Thank you. Okay, so first off, we usually do a little bit of a check-in.
Sure.
So we kind of give us a little bit about how you got into commercial real estate, maybe what kind of client base you kind of either service or your team services, and what is it like to be a leasing broker?
Sure. Great. Well, I started my career with Dell Computers in Austin. Wanted to stay in Austin as long as I could after graduating from UT.
Okay.
Enjoyed the sales process. As you can imagine, Dell was selling a lot of computers, still are. But I was helping as a salesperson for Dell, which gave me a real taste for sales on a rapid fire basis. But I was sitting inside all day and felt like I would be better served doing sales in some other capacity. So in moving back to Houston, I really didn't have a job, but my family had always been involved with real estate, talked to different real estate companies in Houston, and finally settled in on the leasing side. Over my career, I've done both sides where I've represented the building or I've represented the tenant, the user of space. And I felt like my skill set and my sales upbringing or practice would really do better on the tenant rep side. So what I do today is only represent users of space, whether they want to buy something or lease something. I look out for their interests, basically.
Okay. And so that's interesting. You talked about representing the building versus the tenant. And I'm growing to appreciate there's a distinction between the two. And
Absolutely.
So could you break that down maybe a little bit?
Absolutely. So really every product type, and I deal in commercial, so it's really industrial, office, or retail. Really every one of those facets would have someone that represents the building owner. So they're looking out for the owner's interest, trying to get the best economics and lease terms they can for the owner of the building. Because having a full building with maximum rent being paid is going to make the building or the asset as valuable as possible. On the flip side, if you represent the user of space, obviously we want to do the best economic deal for the tenant's perspective, but also negotiate lease terms or buy terms that are more favorable to the tenant. So a lot of times a fair amount of the time you'll have tenants that are unrepresented or a buyer that's unrepresented. And like you said in the opening, most tenants don't do this process, but maybe once every 5, 7, or 10 years. So they really don't have their arms around what I do day to day. And so that you can get lost in the process if you don't have someone looking out for your side. A building owner or a building representative who represents the building owner is going to have a lot more intel than the building owner himself. So they rely on somebody to represent their interests. So, I would say, if you are thinking about going through the process and not using a broker to represent you, consider doing so, because as we'll get into it, today, there are a lot of factors that go into a successful lease transaction or purchase transaction. And 9 times out of 10, that owner is going to have someone representing them. So you should have someone represent your side and leverage their knowledge and experience to get the best results for the user side.
Okay. Makes a lot of sense. So tell me, what kind of trends in commercial leasing? You're Houston, but you actually represent some clients nationally as well.
Yeah.
But like, so what are some trends that you're seeing in office demand post-COVID, submarkets? What's
Yeah.
up? What's
So,
down?
Houston specific, what really is hurting Houston office market is energy. Energy really hasn't come back like it was really up until 2014. After COVID, it really never recovered. You have a lot of investors who feel like, energy is dirty. And so the investment dollars are not there. Well, if people aren't investing to go do exploration, then companies are not hiring and filling up office space like they used to. Houston, is boom or bust, right? So that even though oil has been moderately healthy over the past 5 years since COVID, we really haven't seen the occupancy in the office buildings go back to pre-COVID numbers. Uh, the other headwind we have is the work from home, and so a lot of these companies are either moving departments to work from home permanently or offering hybrid work, which is sometimes in the office, sometimes at home. But that, if you do the math on, not the oil and gas industry not taking as much space, plus you factor in work from home, we've really got an unhealthy office market to date. Now we are seeing companies start to come back to the office, and to get employees excited about coming to the office for recruiting purposes or just to come back to the office, we're seeing a real flight to quality. So in Houston, on the office side,
Oh, that's interesting.
if you build a brand new building, you're going to lease it up pretty quick, even though rents are probably double what other buildings are in Houston. So they're the A minus or B building that is makes up probably 90% of or 80% of the market
Yeah.
is struggling, and we just don't have the velocity of companies growing or moving to Houston that will help soak up some of that vacancy.
Okay. So the ones that are gonna go ahead and bite the bullet and lease the space, if they're gonna do it, let's go for broke. Let's go
Yeah, yeah,
big.
you're seeing the law firms and other users. Now it's expensive, so you're seeing the law firms, some of the engineering firms step up and pay for the higher rates, but that's as an inducement for employees to either come to work for the company or come back to work. But it's really causing a rift in the A minus and B buildings because those buildings are, traditionally 95% leased, are now hovering around 78% leased. And so
That's traditionally, but that's where they are now.
that's where they are now.
In
Now,
the
now
70 to 80% range.
that's exactly right.
Okay. Right.
Which, if you factor in what's going on in interest rates, it
Mm.
makes it really hard for a building owner to go refinance a building. So if they have debt coming due,
Mm.
it's a real conundrum because of the vacancy and lack of tenants in the market. Landlords are giving large incentive packages, free rent, tenant allowance, which we'll talk about,
Yeah.
and the rental rates aren't what they used to be. So if you factor all those together,
Spend
the
more,
value
charge less.
that's exactly right.
Oh
The
wow.
value of the building is not what it was 5 years ago for the most
Okay.
part. So when the debt comes due, they have to go refinance, and most of the time the value is not what it used to be. And so property owners are having to put more money in or
Mm.
decide to walk away from the building altogether, which we're seeing in the market today.
Okay. Well, that was kind of leading into the next question, which is like, and tenantimprovement.com. So we're talking about tenant improvement projects, capital improvement projects, on tenant improvement. So negotiating a tenant improvement allowance, and how should how should a business owner, business manager who's looking at a big lease with some kind of an allowance, how should they think about that, or what should they be?
Well, we approach every transaction pretty much the same. So we want to run a real process on what is the tenant trying to achieve, either through the renewal or through a relocation. So it depends on what the goals are, right? If our perspective is, and it's a really good time to be a tenant in the market because you're really fought after as a occupant in a building. So we want to make sure whether you decide to renew the lease or relocate, you're getting the same incentives across the board. And our job is to look at options in the market, the building that you're in currently, or other buildings in the market, and leverage those buildings to basically compete with each other to give you the best economic terms. If you're just going to renew and maybe do some minor changes to the existing office, then you probably don't need as much tenant improvement dollars.
Mm-hmm.
So we would try to go fight for converting the value of the tenant allowance that a new tenant would need, and convert that into free rent, because that'll be a benefit for you, a free rent or a reduction in the rental rate.
Okay, so it's interesting, and you've helped me on different leases in the past, and I remember you helped. And so this next question is kind of what about hidden costs, and one that you identified on the property that where we had the flex industrial space, all air conditioned, but warehouse and office. The HVAC systems were old, but because of the type of lease we were signing, we actually had to take accountability or responsibility for them.
Right.
So complete replacement, but we negotiated a maintenance thing. But like,
Right.
are there other hidden costs, parking or things like that?
Absolutely. So every building is a little bit different. Every owner has a different perspective or different lens they're looking through. And every deal is a little bit different. But a lot of these buildings are, some of these buildings that are older aren't necessarily ADA compliant, or they don't they don't line up with the current energy codes. So when you occupy the building, you've got to bring ADA issues up to current standards.
Mhm.
But you also have to pay attention to energy codes and certain other things that I would consider as base building cost, right? But that becomes part of the negotiation. Well, we're taking a full floor in a new building, and you're
Mhm.
giving us a certain amount of tenant improvement allowance to build out what we want, but we don't want to pay for upgrading maybe the elevator lobby, or we don't want to upgrade the lighting, the packages, because energy code would dictate. So that becomes part of the negotiation. But on the front end, I think having a real estate broker representing you with an architect and with other trades that we'll get into is key, because we want to push as much of that responsibility onto the landlord, because at the end of the day, we want to move into the building, spend money on the things that are going to be important to the employees, but not have to spend money on base building items that we think the building owner should be responsible for.
Okay. So they kind of leverage you and they say, hey, we've got a Class A building. And you're like, yeah, for the most part, but it's a Class B lobby that you're going to have us lease from. We
Right.
need you to do something,
Exactly.
keep that out of our lease, but y'all fix it.
Exactly. And that goes into the parking garage. How many parking spots can we have? How do we get access for our visitors to the parking garage? Who's responsible for making the ADA changes to the restrooms? Who's going to pay to upgrade the elevator lobby, or maybe the elevator cabs themselves need to be upgraded? And you don't want to move into a building and then all of a sudden have those costs, or the downtime of having the landlord having to renovate those things while you're in there. So, a lot of what my job is making sure that you as the tenant are eyes wide open on the pluses and minuses of every building that we're looking at. And once you move in, what are the pluses and minuses that we're going to have to live with?
Yeah. So we kind of referenced different types of spaces, but so negotiating large space downtown, negotiating, I always tease people in the sense that, not tease people, one of the taglines I have at Floor Zoner Explanation is we'll do 63rd floor of the Chase Tower Class A building downtown, and we'll do a cell phone repair shop on Harwin, which is a lower economic part of
Right.
town, right? So what is like large buildings downtown differences versus, more
Yeah, you
farther out from the downtown
well, you can
district?
get pretty detailed, and downtown, you've got issues with parking, because most of these buildings were built with not enough parking to support the operations of the business. But you also see a trend where engineering firms, or all types of firms, want to be more efficient in their space. They no longer want huge offices for their employees. They want, a few offices for employees, but also a lot of cubes. Well, a lot of these older buildings weren't built that way or to support that. So if you squeeze more people and be more efficient on your office layout,
Mhm.
may have issues with parking. And so a lot of downtown buildings don't have the parking. But if you go further west, a lot of those newer buildings have been built with larger parking ratios, so parking is not an issue.
Okay.
Downtown, the rates are still pretty healthy compared to the Galleria or out in West Chase or the Energy Corridor or up by the airport. The values of those buildings are still higher, so your operating expenses, the cost to run those buildings, are more expensive as well. So if you take the base rate, you add the operating expenses that the tenant is responsible for, it gets pretty expensive to be downtown, despite it being one of the more unhealthy office markets in the city right now.
Okay.
I do a lot of work for companies not only in Houston but across the country. So as we look at different downtown areas or surrounding areas, it's really important to pay attention to those specifics, and you got to be mindful of not only what the monthly rate is going to be, but what's the impact going to be on parking, what's the impact on travel times for employees, what's the impact of overtime air conditioner if you need it.
Right.
So there's all these factors that we have to look out for and hopefully deliver for our tenant whenever they sign the lease, whether it's going to be a renewal or a relocation.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. So here's a good question. What is the most common mistake you think tenants make when they are looking for that next space?
I think the biggest mistake that we see is starting too late in the process, whether they have a lease that's coming up or they want to have a new location up and running in a certain amount of time. They're waiting too long to start the process and then ultimately make a decision on where they want to go. If you factor in the time it takes to negotiate proposals, negotiate the lease contract itself, do construction drawings, which can take 3 months depending on how big the project is. And then the biggest issue we're seeing is permitting, and that's in Houston, but across the board, taking the final drawings, presenting them to the permit office, and then getting an approval is taking longer and longer. And so if you factor all those things in, and then you factor in the time to actually do the construction or do the build out, and then plan an effective move date, you really need the better part of 9 to 16 months. Ideally, and sometimes you can't predict how fast you're going to grow or shrink or whatever the case may be. But the more time you have to do the process and run it effectively, it's going to yield better results on the economics and on the lease terms, and then obviously, and then result in a smoother build out and move than if you try to rush it. And so what we see is tenants waiting too long to start the process or pick an option to move into, and then you get sort of in a quick negotiating time period, which is not going to provide the best results you could get, and you got to make decisions out of duress versus using the time as leverage to get the best economics possible.
Sure. Okay. So I always wondered that, which was how binding is a lease? Because I remember we had, so we leased a space that you'd helped us with. We signed an extension,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like, Johnny on the spot, let's get it signed 6 months before the pandemic. And then the way things worked out with the pandemic, it was really good. And we were able to find and buy this place that you helped us with. But getting out of the lease, I was surprised at how binding a lease is. And so, what do business owners, managers need to realize?
It's binding, and not only the lease term and the economics that are laid out there, but also all the lease terms that are incorporated in that lease. It's a binding agreement. So
Mhm.
once you sign it, you're fairly stuck with it. If there's a bankruptcy or some other major issue, then there's ways to get out of it. But once you sign the lease, it is binding. Now, that goes back to, we wanted to, my role is to negotiate the best economics possible, but also mitigate what the lease says. When the lease comes over from the landlord, it is typically all landlord favorable terms.
Mhm.
And, there's usually 35 to 50 clauses in an average lease, and we do our best to mitigate each one of those clauses as best possible that give you rights, whether it's addressing the operating expenses, addressing how the tenant improvement dollars go, um, or if we can negotiate in termination options or sublease rights into the lease, we definitely want to do that. Our goal is to give you as much flexibility within the lease document as possible, because once you sign it, you are saying you'll adhere to it and live by it until the term is up. But mitigating the terms as best possible on the front end is going to be as beneficial as anything to if there's an issue down the line.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people, and I never, until getting into this business and this industry and stuff, really appreciated, but there's the rent, then there's the tenant improvement expense where you're actually investing dollars, or the landlord is investing dollars for you on your behalf to
Right.
make the space, usable and
Right.
functional and efficient and so forth. And so, obviously that gets built back into the lease, but it's still something above and beyond. But
Yeah.
I had an insurance broker that we talked to. No, he was a claims adjuster about how to handle a insurance claim with a lease on the podcast recently, and he talked about sometimes having insurance brokers review the lease documents. Do you have that? Have you experienced
Yeah,
that, or?
I do. We always encourage, first of all, it's a real team effort on any of these. If you're
Mhm.
going to look at renewing or relocating or setting up a new facility, it's a real team effort. And I think the tenantimprovement.com idea is great because you're bringing all of those trades together, all those resources together
Thank you.
that a tenant will need during the process.
Mhm.
I view my job as more of the quarterback, where I want to make sure the insurance brokers reviewing the lease language for the insurance. I want to make sure the architect is looking over the work letter to make sure we're capturing everything the tenant wants in the space, but also building it that's going to be in line with what the city needs. I do a fair amount of industrial work across the country and in Houston as well, and it's the same. We got to make sure that everything we draw is going to benefit the business, but also be in line with what the city codes are. Because if you sign the document, the lease, and you have a projected start date, you've got to hit that date and be in there before before that date starts. But you also got to make sure the drawings that we're banking on producing are going to be okay with the city and ultimately get permitted. So all those resources together are important to making sure every issue of the lease and every issue of the business is taken care of when the lease starts and throughout the life of the lease.
So, what's an ideal broker tenant relationship kind of thing?
I think it comes
What
down.
makes it work?
I think it comes down to trust. I mean, if there are so many details that the business owner has to pay attention to, but if they can find a broker or a real estate professional that they trust, I can take over a lot of that responsibility, right? So when the tenant trusts me is when we're going to be the most effective, because they've got to trust when I talk about deadlines for making decisions. I talk about insurance, premiums in the lease or clauses in the lease. We talk about construction costs. We talk about operating expense costs. The more they can trust that I'm doing my job correctly, first of all, the less time they have to focus on it.
Yeah.
But I think that yields the best results. So to me, it comes down to trust. And I think over my career on this side of, representing tenants, which has been 20 years or so, as long as the tenant trusts you, we can go deliver the results they want. But when we talk about rental rates and build out cost, and they feel like we're not telling the truth, it becomes a little problematic, because you don't have an unlimited amount of time. You got to make decisions. So if they trust what I'm telling them, obviously those decisions can be easier. If they feel like they have to remain in control and not trust what I'm saying or performing, then it slows the process down and becomes a little bit more of an issue on the timing front.
Okay. All right. So to tease you here, so we've got the quarterback from UT throwing the game-winning touchdown for a national championship. Give me a good war story that, like, did you pull one out in a short time frame? Did you get a bigger concession?
Yeah, I mean,
Any good stories that you can share?
there was a question we haven't talked about, but what is the day in the life of a real
Broker.
estate
Yeah,
broker?
that's a
And
great one.
every day is different, and
Okay.
every deal we work on is different. I will say running the process like we normally run it is the key, because it will eliminate the surprises that come up. And so running the process is key. I think the biggest about 7 years ago, we worked on a deal where a company owned a 10-acre piece of land with a big industrial component and an office component, and they wanted to sell the 10 acres and move into a new building. Well, like we talked about, it takes a while to craft a lease where you're going to move into a new building, but they didn't really want to start the process until the building was under contract. So we get the building under contract, we negotiate the lease for the new building they're going to move into, and then, in the lease, we have some hard dates that we have to hit to make sure we get out of the way for the new buyer of the building. Well, we get everything squared away. We're ready to sign the lease. We're ready to sell the building. And of course, the building falls out of contract. The new buyer walks away, which then puts us in a little bit of a tailspin. But because we were running the process, we had contingency plans. And ultimately, a new buyer arrived and put the building under contract and closed in about 30 days. And it was a big transaction, but that meant we had to restart the lease process and we had to short circuit it and get it done, get the lease signed, get permits pulled, and get them moved in about a 4-month process, which, it was a 2-floor user, which is not a real easy thing to do.
Yeah.
But by that time, because of the ups and downs, we had a really good trust with our client. And so they sort of threw it in our lap to make the decisions on lease terms, rental rates, all that kind of stuff. And we ultimately met the deadline and got them moved over in time. But there's a lot of stories we can get into. I think most of them will revert back to the lack, having a lack of time, whether it's from the build out not signing the lease in time, so the build out takes longer. And there was one where we had an existing lease that we had to be out on a certain date, but because they didn't sign the lease on time, the construction got delayed. So you have a provision in your lease called holdover, which was basically, was going to be forced upon the tenant. We figured out a solution and got them out of the current building in time, and so they didn't pay the holdover. But holdover really is about 200% increase in rent. So all of a sudden they're doubling their rent.
Yeah.
We found a contingency and moved them in.
Doubling plus paying the new.
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Oh man. All right. Well, so one last question, then I'll close this out. But the question is partners in real estate. You talked about big clients. You talked about other parts of the country. Um, and I wanted to just also highlight that you also talked about helping people buy and sell real estate as well as lease. And a tenant improvement, capital improvement, or construction process could be related to any one of those. So
Right.
if
Absolutely.
anybody out there is listening and thinking of buying, Charlie would be a great person. If they're thinking about selling, leasing, Charlie would be a great person. Tell me about, just real quick, partners in real estate. We'll sum that up and then I'll close this out.
Yeah, so Partners in Real Estate, we are a privately held independent real estate firm, which I think allows us to spend more time on the process for our clients. We do not have investors, or we're not private, we're not a publicly traded company, so we're not trying to push deals through as fast as possible.
Mhm.
Again, on the timing standpoint, the more time the client can give us, the more effective we're going to be. But if we're buying something or leasing something, Partners has every one of those attributes. So if I don't do I don't do a lot of retail, but within our company we have a retail professional. So if you're looking at buying a retail building and need to understand what the cost is going to be to build out for a new use or for other tenants, our company can do that. If we wanted to manage if you wanted us to manage the building of a new building, we can go do that. We have a development arm. We have a fund business that is basically taking money from private investors and using it to go buy assets that we think are undervalued.
Okay.
So that group is scrubbing, the economics on all these office buildings in Houston and Texas, across the country, really office, industrial, and retail. So we have a really good database of what buildings are trading for. That would be able, you could back into what rent should be or could be in an asset. But that also helps our brokerage side, because we can look at their data and understand what building basis an individual owner has, and then we can back into a lease structure or a purchase structure that would be most beneficial to the buyer or lessor.
Kind of like a 360 view of real estate.
That's exactly right. I mean,
Okay.
we cover the whole front. We now have offices in Houston, San Antonio, Dallas, and Atlanta,
Mhm.
and Austin. So we cover we have flags in a lot of markets. And in addition, we're doing deals across the country and up in Canada and really around the globe at this point. But we have the data points to help use that for crafting buying terms or leasing terms for our clients.
Perfect. All right. Well, Charlie, you've been a great
Well,
guest.
thank you for having me. I think
Yeah.
it's a great program you're running. I think it's a great resource
Thank
for
you.
whatever your use is in real estate. I think tenantimprovement.com is a great resource and should be very beneficial for anybody that's getting ready to go through the process.
Cool. Thank you so much. This is, again, Charlie Neuhaus with Partners in Real Estate, Jeff Mago with tenantimprovement.com. The Lease and Build podcast. Go ahead and click like, and subscribe. I'm supposed to say that at the end of each one of these sessions. But thank you so much. Watch for more as it comes out.